Welcome back to the next part of the Flutter Pipeline series. In the previous video, we looked at setting up our Android build job, and we also signed our Android AAB, and we had a quick look at setting up YAML templates so that we can reuse some of our initialization steps in the iOS job, which we'll be setting up in this video. So in this video, we'll be building and signing our iOS app, installing and creating our certificates and provisioning profiles that we require, and finally building and signing our Flutter iOS IPA, which will also publish to the pipeline artifacts. So let's jump straight in. So coming back to our build script, we currently only have a bunch of steps executing to build our Android app. So if you recall from one of the previous videos where I mentioned that by default, Azure DevOps Pipelines creates a generic job for us to execute all these steps in, even though we didn't mention anything about jobs here. Jobs are just a great way of grouping a bunch of these steps, and each job executes in a different virtual machine environment. We need to build our iOS app on a macOS virtual machine, and then the Android app can build on our Ubuntu, a virtual machine. The way we can do that is by specifying jobs, and then we can create a job by typing job, and we can give it a name. So I'm just going to call this iOS job, and it needs to be one word so that we can reference it. So that way we can set up dependencies and reference this job, as I'll show you in a bit. And then we can specify a display name, just some friendly name so that we can identify it in our pipeline. And we can specify the environment that it needs to run in. So I'm going to copy this from here, and instead of running it on Ubuntu latest, I want the iOS job to run on macOS latest. And then we can specify some steps as well and execute our iOS job from here. And I'll do the same for the Android job. So I'll just specify -job :Android job and give it a display name. And we want the Android job to run in an Ubuntu environment. So the entire stage is running on Ubuntu, and then it kicks off an iOS build job that runs on macOS and an Android build job that runs on Ubuntu latest. And then we just need to fix this indentation here of these steps. So select all the rest and tab that in once, and there we go. I'm going to set up a dependency just so that you can see how that works, and it comes with the benefit that so that we always make sure our iOS job runs first, since we'll be testing now and we might make some mistakes and so on. So we rather want the build to fail quite early on, and then you can always remove that later on, especially if you have something like parallel pipelines. So the way we can do that, we can add a depends on here, and then you can specify the iOS job. So that way it will always ensure that the iOS job executes first before trying to execute the Android job. So we can add some steps for our iOS job. If you recall from the previous time, we set up a setup Flutter template, which installs our Flutter onto this virtual machine. It runs Flutter Doctor and does a Flutter pub get. So simply by copy and pasting this single line, we are now also executing all those steps in our iOS job. So we don't need to install Java. We're not going to download this key.properties or key store. We are going to install a certificate and provisioning profile, but I'll get to that in a bit. But we do want to build our Flutter app, copy the artifact to the staging directory, and finally publish that artifact. I'm going to copy these last three steps to my iOS job as well. Just make sure you get the indentation right. This is not going to be build Flutter Android app. It's going to be build Flutter iOS app. And we can do a control space to see what our options here are. So we instead want to build an IPA. So we can just put that in there. And we're still building from our root directory. Then we want to copy our IPA artifact to the staging directory. So instead of specifying this, we can say any directory with any file name that ends with a .ipa. So the reason we couldn't do that with the Android side with the AAB is there's a couple of AABs that gets created when you build a Flutter Android app in different directories. So all of those would have been copied to our artifact staging directory. But that's not the case with IPA, so we can just say any IPA in any directory, and that will copy it to our artifact staging directory, and finally it will publish it. I'll just change the artifact name to iOS instead, and just remove this comment. And I see we didn't add a display name here, so let me just add that. And we can just copy that for our Android step as well. Okay, great. So this will probably fail because we're going to need the certificate and provisioning profile. But let's execute this and just see what happens at this stage. So I'm going to commit and push this to my production branch. So we can see the iOS job executing first because we set up the dependency so that the Android job waits for our iOS job successful completion before executing the Android job. And we can see here that the install Flutter, run Flutter Doctor, and run Flutter pub-get successfully was added from our YAML template onto our iOS job. So that pretty much went as expected. So we got an error message stating that no development certificates are available to code sign the app for device deployment. So we'll need to get our iOS certificate for distribution as well as a provisioning profile for this app. So if you already have a certificate and provisioning profile, you can head over to the library under secure files, and you can just click on the plus secure file and upload them here. And so you can skip the next section while I'll just quickly run you through creating a certificate and provisioning profile for your app. So the first thing that you'll need is a certificate. So you can log into your developer.apple.com and sign in with your developer account and go to the certificates tab, and we're going to click on create certificate if you don't have one already. And then we need to select the type of certificate that we need. So during development, you'll be using your development certificate to sign. But for our pipeline, we want to use the Apple distribution certificate. So we're going to select that one, since this is what we're going to use to actually push to the store as well in the end, once we've done our production build with the pipeline. I'm going to click continue. And then it's going to ask you to upload a certificate signing request. And for this part, you do need a Mac. So heading over to my Mac, you can open Spotlight Search and search for keychain access by pressing Command Space. And then going to the menu at the top and selecting the certificate assistant, and then selecting request a certificate from a certificate authority. In the wizard, provide a user email address and a common name. You can leave the CA email address blank. Select Save to Disk and click Continue. Find a suitable place to store the certificate signing request so that we can upload that to App Store Connect. Great, so now that we've generated our signing request, we can upload that file to developer.apple.com. Make sure you have the correct one selected and then continue. It will give you the certificate details, and then it'll give you a .cer file to download that will need to import into our keychain access on our Mac, that we can export a P12 file that will finally be able to upload to Azure DevOps. So coming back to our Mac, we can just double click on the .cer file, and that will get loaded into our keychain access. So if we open keychain access, we can right click on our certificate and select export Apple distribution certificate. Select a suitable location to store your .p12 certificate file. It will prompt you to create a password for your certificate. This is the password that will actually be used when signing an app. So we'll actually also have to add this password to Azure DevOps secret variables. Once you've added a strong enough password, it will then prompt you for your max password to actually be able to export this key. The next thing that we'll need is a bundle ID. So you can head over to the identifiers tab and click on the plus button to add a new identifier. And we want to select the app IDs. And it's an app that we're trying to create. So here you can give it a description. So I'm just going to call this Flutter Pipeline Demo. And the bundle ID is usually in the format of com.yourcompany's name dot the app's name. And you can select some capabilities here if your app specifically requires it, like push notifications or yeah, there's a whole list here. So you can continue once you're happy with your selections and then select the register button. Great, now that we have a certificate and an identifier, we just need to link the two with by setting up a provisioning profile. So I'm going to add one here. So for debugging purposes, you can create an iOS app development provisioning profile. But for this, we want to actually release to the App Store with our pipeline. So I'm going to go under the distribution section and select the App Store Connect one. Then you can use the drop down to select your ID that you just created. We can continue. So here we can select the certificate that we want to link it to, which is our distribution certificate that we created earlier. We can continue, and then you can just give your provisioning profile a friendly name. And you can select the generate option. And then finally, there's a download button that allows you to download your provisioning profile as well. Great, so now that we have our provisioning profile and certificate ready, we can upload it to Azure DevOps Secure Files by going to Library and then going to the Secure Files tab and clicking on the plus secure file. And then we can just drag in our files here. Great, there we go. So the other thing that we'll need to do is specify our certificate's password here as a secret variable. So I'll create a new variable group called iOS, and the variable that I want to create is going to be called certificate password. And then you can click this little lock here to change the variable type to a secret. And then we can just save that as well. So coming back to our build script, we can just add in the steps to install our certificate and provisioning profile. Fortunately, there are already steps specifically created for this purpose. So you can just search for install Apple certificate. And we can take the latest version, and we want the first two parameters. We want to specify the secure file as well as the certificate password. So I'm going to do that right after my setup Flutter template before my build. So the secure file, I'm just going to copy it right from here so to make sure I don't make a typo. It's called certificates.p12 in my case. And then the certificate password is going to be $, and then in brackets certificate. Let's rather copy that as well. Certificate password in my case. And then we just need to remember to also include our iOS variable group. So that will then install our Apple certificate and sign it with this password. The next thing that we'll need is to install our provisioning profile. So there's also a step for that called install Apple provisioning profile. Version 1 seems to be the latest version. And we just need to specify the actual file's name here. And this file's name can also just copy from our secure files. There we go. That will install our certificate and provisioning profile. So if we commit and push this, the build will still fail because we need to set up an ExportOptions.plist. And the best way to do that is by creating an IPA archive once on your Mac. And that will then set everything ready for you and create your ExportOptions.plist that you can then include in your pipeline. That will then from there on automate the whole process for you. So I'm just going to commit this now. So we just need to give the pipeline permission to our new secure files and our variable group as well. So here we can see we're basically failing with pretty much exactly the same error as before. So we'll need to set up that export options plist to link everything together so that the Flutter app actually signs with the correct certificate. So let's head over to the Mac and set everything up on that side. So coming over to the Mac, you can open XCode and you immediately want to go to XCode settings and then just click the download manual profiles button to download our provisioning profiles that we set up earlier to make sure that it's ready to be accessed on XCode. You can then select the open existing project and navigate to your Flutter repository where you've cloned your project, and inside it go to the iOS folder, and inside the iOS folder you'll see there is a runner.xc workspace and you can select open there. We want to specify a couple things here in the general tab, so let's just give the app a display name and a version, which will in any case overwrite in our pipeline. And you can then go to the signing and capabilities tab. So we want to set up our release signing so that we can actually distribute our app. So I'm going to deselect automatic manage signing, and then I'm going to just fix my bundle ID here. So this needs to match exactly the identifier that you specified on the developer Apple website. Once you've successfully specified that correctly, it should automatically detect your distribution profile that you set up. This will then also assign the right team and the signing certificate. So once all of that has been set up, you might get the following error when trying to build for the first time in XCode, stating that a Generated.xcconfig file can't be found. The way to get around this is by opening your project in VS Code and doing a Flutter build IPA in the console. The build might still fail, but it will generate any necessary files for you. Be sure to set your build target as any iOS device. So now we're ready to create our archive. So we can go to product and select the archive option. It will then build in the background. Once it's successfully built, we can then select the distribute app option. We want to select custom and select next. Here we want to select the App Store Connect option. And we want to select the export option. Since we don't actually want to upload to App Store Connect right now, we first want to just export so that we can get all the settings ready for our pipeline. So we just need to specify a language. Just going to change the name here as well. And we can leave all of these as is. Here you can just select your provisioning profile again. And finally we come to this end screen where we can select the export option. And I'm going to leave it to export right in my iOS folder. And I'm going to leave it as that. Now if we go to VS Code and we explore our iOS folder, you'll see it created this whole folder with an actual IPA that it bundled for us. But what we're actually interested in is the ExportOptions.plist. This file we need for our build pipeline. So I'm going to drag this file out into my iOS folder and move that. And then I'm going to delete the entire runner folder since I don't actually want to commit that to my repository. Great, so we finally have our export options file. So we can go back to our build script, and then we just need to specify our export options here in the Flutter build task for our IPA. So there's a property called ExportOptions.plist, and we just need to specify the path here, which is in the iOS folder. And then I'm just gonna select rename here so I can copy this and specify it over there. So that will then tell our Flutter build task where our export options is, which will link everything together for us. So let's commit all these changes and see what our pipeline does with it. Great, we can see both our iOS and Android jobs completed successfully. It managed to build our iOS app and sign it and export the IPA to our artifacts and still executed our Android job successfully. So if we go to the artifacts now, you'll see there is our iOS signed IPA and our Android signed AAB, ready to be consumed by our release pipeline to be pushed to the stores. So remember to like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the future videos where we'll be covering automatically versioning our apps and pushing it to the stores via our release pipeline. See you next time.